Imagine a crew of 18 frozen, terrified people, including 2 small children, trapped on a breaking piece of Arctic ice in the dead of winter. The wind is howling at gale force, pitch-black darkness surrounds them, and their ship, the Polaris, has just vanished into the blizzard, leaving them to drift into the freezing open ocean. For nearly 200 days, this makeshift ice raft would be their only home. But the real horror of the Polaris expedition didn't start on the ice. It began months earlier with a silver spoon, a cup of coffee, and a calculated murder that remained hidden beneath the frozen tundra for nearly a century. To understand how a prestigious American expedition to the North Pole turned into a psychological thriller, we have to look at the man who built it. Charles Francis Hall was not a sailor, nor was he a scientist. He was a former blacksmith and journalist from Ohio who became utterly obsessed with the Arctic. He had already spent years living among the Inuit, learning their survival skills and searching for the lost Franklin expedition. Hall was a man of intense passion, but he was also deeply paranoid and fiercely defensive of his authority. In 1871, after years of intense lobbying, Hall managed to convince the United States Congress to fund a grand national prize, a journey to become the first humans to stand at the North Pole. The government handed him $50,000 and a converted military tugboat named the Peridot, which Hall proudly renamed the Polaris. But the expedition was doomed before the hull even touched the Atlantic. To secure funding and scientific backing, Hall had to make compromises that would cost him his life. The crew he assembled was a volatile mixture of nationalities, ambitions, and deep personal hatreds. Hall was the commander, but the official sailing master was Sidney Buddington, a cynical, seasoned whaling captain from Connecticut who had a well-known problem with the ship's liquor supply. Buddington didn't share Hall's idealistic dream of reaching the pole, he just wanted to survive and get paid. To make matters worse, Congress insisted that a scientific team accompany the voyage. They chose Dr. Emil Bessels, a brilliant, highly educated German scientist and physician. Bessels openly despised Hall, viewing the American commander as an uneducated, unscientific amateur who had no right to lead men into the high Arctic. From day one on the decks of the Polaris, Bessels refused to take orders from Hall, creating a quiet, toxic rebellion among the German crew members. By the time the ship stopped in Greenland to pick up supplies and Hall's trusted Inuit guides, Joe and Hans, the atmosphere on board was suffocating. Hall wrote frantic letters back to his sponsors, complaining that his officers were openly mutinous, while Buddington and Bessels sneered behind the commander's back. Yet, despite the psychological warfare on board, the Polaris was an incredibly tough ship. In August 1871, she pushed through the treacherous waters of Baffin Bay and sailed higher north than any vessel in recorded history, reaching an astonishing latitude of 82 degrees, 11 minutes north. The open water was right there. The North Pole was tantalizingly close, but the rapidly advancing winter ice began to close in like a steel trap. Buddington, terrified of getting the ship crushed, demanded they turn back immediately. Hall, driven by sheer willpower, refused. After a fierce argument on the bridge, they found a small sheltered bay on the coast of Greenland, which Hall named Thank God Harbor. The Polaris was anchored, her engines went silent, and the crew prepared to face the brutal, months-long darkness of the polar night. The ice outside was freezing solid, but inside the wooden walls of the ship, the hatred between the leaders was about to boil over into cold-blooded murder. If you are fascinated by these raw, unfiltered accounts of human survival and historical mysteries, make sure to hit the subscribe button right now. We are just getting into the darkest chapter of this voyage, and you don't want to miss how the crew survived what came next. Leave a comment below if you think a crew could ever succeed with this level of internal sabotage. With the ship locked in winter quarters, Hall decided to make a temporary reconnaissance journey by sled to find a route north for the upcoming spring. On October 10, 1871, Hall, along with his guide Joe and 2 officers, left the Polaris. For 2 weeks, they battled the freezing winds, mapping the path ahead. Hall was in high spirits, healthy, and full of energy. But when the scouting party returned to Thank God Harbor on October 24th, everything changed in an instant. Hall walked into the warm cabin of the Polaris, exhausted but triumphant. He called for a hot drink to warm his bones. Someone, likely from the galley or the medical bay, handed the commander a steaming cup of coffee. Hall drank it down. Within less than an hour, he fell violently ill. His stomach burned, his throat constricted, and he collapsed into his bunk, vomiting uncontrollably. Dr. Bessels rushed to the commander's side, diagnosing him with an immediate apoplectic stroke. But the treatment Bessels provided was highly unusual, and instead of improving, Hall's condition deteriorated into absolute madness. For 2 weeks, the cabin of the Polaris became a psychological house of horrors. Hall would rally for a day, his mind clear, only to sink back into terrifying fits of delirium. He became completely convinced that the crew was trying to murder him. He refused all food and medicine from Dr. Bessels, screaming that the German scientist was pouring poison into his cups. Hall would only eat food prepared directly by his loyal Inuit friend Joe or his clerk. He grew so paranoid that he demanded his loaded revolver be kept by his side at all times, pointing it at anyone who opened his cabin door. The crew watched in stunned silence as their leader lost his mind. Dr. Bessels calmly assured everyone that the commander was simply suffering from a mental breakdown caused by the isolation and pressure. For a brief moment on November 6th, Hall seemed to recover. He stood up, walked around the deck, and spoke normally with his officers. He thought the danger had passed. But that evening, after receiving another injection and treatment from Dr. Bessels, Hall sank into a deep, unresponsive coma. On the morning of November the 8th, 1871, Charles Francis Hall died. He was buried ashore in the frozen mud of Greenland under a bleak, dark sky. With Hall out of the way, Captain Sidney Buddington immediately assumed full command of the expedition, while Dr. Bessels took control of the scientific operations. Buddington lost no time in celebrating. He unlocked the ship's medical stores and alcohol lockers, and a wave of heavy drinking and apathy washed over the crew. The dream of reaching the North Pole was officially buried in the grave with Hall. Buddington and Bessels had achieved exactly what they wanted, total control, but their celebration would be short-lived because the Arctic was about to punish them for their arrogance. The death of Commander Hall marked the end of order on the Polaris, but the real test of survival was just beginning. As the endless polar night finally gave way to the pale light of spring in 1872, Captain Buddington showed absolutely no interest in pushing north toward the pole. His only goal was to escape. He waited until the summer sun began to crack the massive ice sheets, and on August 12th, the Polaris fired up her engines and began her retreat south toward home. But the Arctic does not let its prisoners go easily. Within days, the ship was heavily beset by giant packs of drifting ice. For 2 brutal months, the Polaris was helplessly carried south by the currents, trapped inside a massive ice floe like a toy in a vise. The ice pressure grew stronger every day, the wooden hull groaning and violently shaking under the immense force. By October, they had drifted down into Smith Sound, surrounded by towering icebergs and blinding snowstorms. Then came the night of October 15th, 1872, a night that would rewrite maritime history. A ferocious gale smashed into the ice pack. Giant blocks of ice began to ride up over each other, slamming directly into the sides of the Polaris. Suddenly, a loud, terrifying crack echoed from beneath the deck. The ship was being lifted completely out of the water by the ice, and the carpenter frantically reported that water was rushing into the hold. Panic erupted on board. Believing the ship was about to break apart and sink into the abyss, Captain Buddington screamed into the storm to start throwing everything onto the ice floe beside the ship. In the pitch-black darkness, amidst blinding snow and screaming winds, the crew went into a frenzy. Men tossed barrels of flour, boxes of hardtack, muskets, ammunition, and canvas tents onto the shifting, unstable ice. In the middle of this chaos were the Inuit families, including Hans Hendrik's wife and their newborn baby, huddled together on the freezing ice sheet. Out of the 33 people on board, 19 were now standing on the ice, desperately trying to organize the scattered supplies while the remaining crew stayed on the ship, pumping water out of the leaking hull. Then the final catastrophe struck. A massive pressure wave hit the ice pack. With a sound like a cannon shot, the great ice floe split right down the middle. In an instant, the mooring line snapped. The 19 people on the ice watched in absolute horror as the Polaris was violently ripped away by the wind and driven into the dark, stormy fog. Within seconds, the ship disappeared completely. 19 souls, including 9 Europeans and Americans, 9 Inuit and 2 small children, were left abandoned on a floating piece of ice in the middle of a freezing Arctic gale. They had no ship, no communication, and no hope of rescue. If you are amazed by how these individuals face the ultimate test of human endurance, tell us in the comments what you would do if you found yourself on a shrinking piece of ice in the dark. Don't forget to hit that like button to help more history fans discover this unbelievable forgotten story. The group on the ice looked around at their terrifying new reality. They were trapped on a flat piece of frozen ocean, roughly half a mile wide. They had 2 small whaleboats that had been pulled onto the ice, a few canvas tents, and a highly limited supply of food. The temperature was plummeted far below zero, and the winter darkness was closing in again. Among the abandoned group was Tyson, the assistant navigator, who tried to establish some form of military order, but the European sailors were cynical and refused to cooperate, focused only on their own survival. The true heroes of this nightmare were the Inuit hunters, Joe Ebier-Bing and Hans Hendrik. Without them, every single white man on that ice floe would have been dead within a week. As the canvas tents proved completely useless against the freezing gales, Joe and Hans immediately went to work, constructing sturdy snow igloos that kept the group sheltered from the deadly wind. But shelter was only half the battle. The food supplies tossed from the Polaris were running out rapidly. Tyson rationed the hardtack and dried meat to starvation levels, leaving everyone constantly weak, shivering, and desperate. Once again, Joe saved their lives. Day after day, in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, Joe would lie flat on his stomach near the cracks in the ice, waiting for hours for a seal to surface for air. Whenever he caught one, the entire camp celebrated, devouring the raw meat and using the seal blubber as fuel to melt ice into drinking water. But as the weeks turned into months, their frozen prison began to disintegrate. The current was carrying their ice floe steadily south into the warmer waters of the Atlantic. What started as a massive half-mile field of ice was now rapidly melting, breaking apart into smaller and smaller chunks. By March 1873, the floe had shrunk so drastically that waves were constantly washing over the edges, soaking their igloos and destroying their remaining supplies. In April, a massive storm completely shattered what was left of their ice raft, forcing all 19 people to crowd into a single leaking whaleboat, surrounded by freezing, churning water. They were starving, frostbitten, and exhausted to the point of death. Then on April 30th, 1873, through the dense morning fog off the coast of Labrador, a miraculous sight appeared. The crew of the commercial whaling steamer Tigris spotted a tiny dark shape bobbing among the icebergs. As they steered closer, they couldn't believe their eyes. 19 emaciated, ghostly figures were waving their arms from a battered wooden boat. Against all mathematical and geographical odds, after drifting over 1,500 miles and surviving 197 days on a melting piece of ice, every single person, including the children, had survived. The rescue of the Polaris ice floe survivors shocked the world, but it also opened a massive investigation into what actually happened on that ship. The remaining crew on the Polaris had run the ship aground in Greenland, survived the winter with the help of local Inuit, and were eventually rescued by a Scottish whaler. When both groups returned to Washington, the Naval Court held intense hearings. Captain Buddington and Dr. Bessels blamed each other for the failure of the expedition, and Bessels claimed that Commander Hall had died of natural causes. Because there was no proof, the case was closed, and the truth went to the grave with the men. But history always leaves a trail. In 1968, nearly a century later, an official biographer named Chauncey Loomis traveled to the desolate coast of Greenland to find Hall's grave. He exhumed the frozen, perfectly preserved body of the commander and took tissue samples. The forensic results shocked the scientific community. Charles Francis Hall had not suffered a stroke. His body was filled with lethal, massive doses of arsenic administered during the final 2 weeks of his life, exactly when he was accusing Dr. Bessels of poisoning him. The uneducated explorer had been right all along. He was murdered in cold blood by his own medical officer. What do you think was the true motive behind this chilling Arctic murder? Was it scientific jealousy or a desperate bid for survival? Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you in the next dark chapter of history.